this other portion of what we wanted to talk about tonight, which is interpretation as a response to a changing world. I'm going to seed this just a little bit more. I'm fascinated to hear your responses to this. A lot has been spoken and written about the fact that we are unfortunately living in a world, a post-truth era, where scientific empirical understanding, where shared understanding is less important, it seems, and where we're losing our ability to find a common framework of facts that we can agree on. What is the role that an interpreter steps into in this day and age to try to address this phenomenon? And what challenges does encountering visitors in this post-truth era bring to you as you're trying to impart real factual knowledge about a place? That was a two-part challenging question. So,
well, the one part of it, Millward, I think it's just so difficult right now because we are dealing with misinformation. We are dealing with people who are not necessarily acknowledging reality. There are conspiracy theories out there. Our country here in the United States is in turmoil because of some things that are going on that have to do with the lack of truth. And we have seen this now for some time. So it's a real challenge. I've been reading a book. It's called Think Again by Adam Grant. And he says that we need to all be taking a scientific lens to our thinking, and that by doing so, we're more likely to acknowledge that we may not have all the answers. And I think that's probably important for all of us, and particularly interpreters. I think that this is something that is a problem. I don't believe there are easy answers.
Yeah, I agree with Larry that I really don't think that there are any easy answers. It's challenging. You know, there are things that have, there are things that have become politicized that should never be political, and in many cases there have been direct collisions with those things and many of the resources that we are charged with preserving, protecting, and interpreting about. And it definitely becomes a real challenge when you have such a polarized environment societally that folks don't even want to listen to each other, that there's a reluctance out there to entertain different points of view in this type of environment, which really runs against a lot of what we are supposed to be doing as interpreters, which is to acknowledge and discuss and look at things from many different points of view. We, as someone in the chat just said, I think that's John Cole, that there are multiple ways of knowing, and it is challenging when some of these ways seem to be based on things that are not cultural traditions, not historical facts, not science, not, they seem to come from things that we don't tend to value very much. And it is tricky of how we can do this in a way that we still engage our audiences, even knowing that some of them are working with a very different concept of what truth is and what reality is. I don't know that we have I don't know that anyone's really figured out how to do this well just yet, but I think that all we can do is to pull on all of our tools of that we use in the trade in terms of presenting things different ways, different styles, providing enough there for folks to still connect with the resources and walk away making their own connections, even if it's not one that we might agree with personally, and being okay with that. We're not necessarily here to make sure that everyone walks away with an exact understanding of the science behind the biology of a sequoia, for example. But I think that to some degree we need to make our peace with the fact that not all visitors and audience members are going to take away what we would like for them to take away. But in the end, maybe that doesn't matter so much, because if they forge a connection that's meaningful to them, that will benefit our resources and our sites in the long run. And I think we just have to make peace with that and keep working on how to do this in this kind of environment.
there's something that just came into the chat box, and it touches on what we're talking about here, and I think it's important. And I think what's happening in interpretation, Mary, is hopeful in that various interpretive sites are now telling a fuller and more comprehensive story of our nation's history. Now, Kelly is doing this in the sites where she works, and I'm actually really looking forward to hearing about John Muir, which we talked about in our planning session a week ago. But I'd like to point out that in a number of places, including museums, plantations, historic sites, churches of the civil rights movement, all of these places are now telling a broader story that is more accurate. And although it might make some people uncomfortable, it's something that's very important if we are going to reach a point of healing. And I've got a couple of examples. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. It's a Smithsonian museum, and it opened in 2016. We've got the Whitney Plantation, which instead of interpreting the big house is interpreting enslavement on a sugar plantation just outside of New Orleans. It opened in 2014. James Madison's Montpelier opened in 2017, an exhibit called The Mere Distinction of Color about enslavement at James Madison's estate. And at Jefferson's Monticello, 2018, an exhibit now which tells the Sally Hemings story. As it turns out, my girlfriend and I started exploring these interpretive sites a couple of years ago. The pandemic sort of put a hold on some of the research we were doing, but we went to all of the sites that I mentioned, and then I started writing a series of columns for Legacy Magazine. And that's the journal for the National Association for Interpretation. And these are under the banner of Justice for All. And so what my purpose was is to investigate what we're doing in the interpretive field to address social justice issues. And again, this is happening right now. It is relatively new. And the history, of course, goes back, well, in some instances, 400 years. And yet we're just now talking about these things that I think and hope will shift us to a more caring and unified nation.
Thank you, Larry. And Kelly, not to put you on the spot, but John Muir has been in the news recently. And I think we're very fortunate that we have you with us tonight and that you interpret the site with his name. And in terms of one of the themes of this conversation about telling a more diverse, more broad, inclusive story, when we learn different and more about more things about what we thought we knew that really challenge us. Can I put you on the spot and ask you to share what your experience of this has been?
Sure, but before you do that, I need to just show off my Whitney Plantation water bottle that I just happen to have next to me. That was not planned. It just happens to be the water bottle I have right now. Just to shout out to the Whitney that we're doing in the chat as well as here. I should mention too that the reason why a lot of NAI members are very familiar with Whitney Plantation is that 3 years ago, when we had the conference in New Orleans in 2018, the Whitney was one of the destinations for one of the offsite trips. And so a lot of us got to go to that plantation and compare it with another one that was nearby and had an amazing tour and a really powerful sense of what that kind of interpretation can be like. It was unforgettable, I think, for everyone that was on that. And so it is a unique site down there. Yeah, so John Muir's been in the news lately, which is impressive considering how long he's been gone. John Muir is a small site. There are a number of sites in the Park Service that do interpret John Muir, Yosemite, there's Muir Woods, and the John Muir National Historic Site is the place where Muir lived with his wife and his 2 children. And that was his home that he came back to after all of his travels. And we have long known that some of John Muir's writings are, shall we say, typical of the perspectives of white men of privilege of that time in terms of how they thought about non-white folks in general. There are things in a few of his published works that do allude to this. My First Summer in the Sierra, he has some very uncomplimentary things to say about Native Americans living in the Yosemite Valley. And I guess we've known this for many years, but it really kind of hit the media pretty strongly last summer. It's kind of off and on for a couple of years, but especially last summer, when the Sierra Club came out. Was it last? I have to say the pandemic is causing me to lose track of when what is happening. But the Sierra Club surprised us in the middle of the pandemic and came out with this. They didn't talk to us about it before they did it, which they didn't have to, but it would have been nice to have a heads up before we had media crews staking out our site. And they basically published a very open letter announcing and saying that that Muir had some of these writings that they disavowed, that they found problematic, and that they were, and that started this whole conversation about, was John Muir a racist, and are we canceling Muir and things like that. So so I have a couple of interesting things to say about that. First of all, one of the things that we had to make very clear to our staff when we had reporters calling pretty quickly is that we are not in the business of defending Muir. Muir's writings stand for themselves. We are not in the business of defending. We're not going to, I think it's a mistake to try to put too much of the Sierra Club controversy on Muir. Muir is the best known member of a group of preservationists and very famous conservationists and preservationists, many of whom were involved with the eugenics movement, actually. Muir was not, but many of his contemporaries were. And some of them have written whole books on about these topics that are far worse, in my opinion, my personal opinion, than the few sentences here and there that you can point to where Muir says uncomplimentary things about folks. So in some ways, Muir is kind of taking the heat for that entire group of early conservationists and preservationists, some of which he probably deserves and some of which he probably doesn't, because he was not involved with some of what they were involved in. So we're not really here to defend Muir, and we're not really here to condemn him either. I think that it really is an example of how, like it or not, this is part of Muir's legacy. And we need to really take a look at the impact of his words. Because to me, the question of, was a wealth, well, he married into his wealth. Maybe many people don't really know that. Muir did not grow up in privilege. He actually married a woman who ended up inheriting a lot of money from her parents. And it was that financial support from his wife that enabled him to actually be the advocate that he was, and to travel and to write and everything else. And so he certainly exercised privilege in that context. And it's not surprising that he would have had some of those perspectives of Native Americans not being equal to Caucasians and African Americans not being equal to Caucasians. That was sort of, that was what everybody thought at the time, more or less, or many people at the time. So that's not really a very interesting question to me of, was Muir a racist, or just how racist was John Muir? Although I think that will certainly be the topic of many dissertations. And to be honest, we are working with University of Pacific, which has most of Muir's papers, to really dig into some of his writings and see what they may have to offer into some insight into this issue, because it is, from an academic perspective, an interesting question. But from an interpretive perspective, I don't think it is. I think the question of, was Muir racist, is not very exciting. I think that what is more interesting is, what does it mean for the field of conservation that so many of its early founders of the field, so many of our founding fathers of the fields of preservation and conservation and national parks, what does it mean that so many of these folks had these perspectives and had these views? What does that mean? What does it say? What are the current impacts of the entire system that we have of preserving these special places? The fact that it was conceived of and designed by wealthy white men. Could that have something to do with the fact that visitation and a diverse workforce are still not what we would like them to be in these fields? There may be a connection there. And so to me, the question of how racist was John Muir that's not the conversation I want to have. I want to have the conversation of, what are the bigger implications of John Muir having thought the way that he did. He certainly wasn't right about everything. We know that. He had, for example, the impact of fire on the natural landscape. He had no conception of the role that fire has played in shaping the landscape. That was not something that was well understood at the time that he was a naturalist. And so Muir certainly wasn't perfect. He didn't know everything, and he made plenty of mistakes. We need to really take these sorts of figures down off of the pedestals that we've kept them on all these years, and look at their legacy with a critical eye, and really ask those broader questions. And so that's the conversation we want to be having about John Muir and his writings. And I think it's important that folks understand what it means to visitors of color to read those writings from Muir, and to, like, how does that make us feel? Does that make me feel comfortable coming to the John Muir site, knowing that John Muir wrote disparaging things about African Americans while he was on his 1,000-mile trek to the Gulf? I think that it's important that we understand the impact that does have today on people who read those writings, and that we give them the space to articulate that, and that we talk about what it means for this field.
Thank you, Kelly, for that very in-depth, thoughtful response. And I think we're seeing that reflected in the chat. Don, you had a kind of a visceral reaction to part of what Kelly was saying. I wanted to ask you generally where making an attempt to emphasize a more diverse story kind of lands for you in your work, and any reaction to what you've heard that you'd like to share with us.
Thank you. It's the core of, like, so I work now as a planner. I've worked in all kinds of different aspects of interpretation, but now I work as a planner. It's the core of my work now, is how do we do exactly what Kelly was just saying, take these really, really problematic histories and make them relevant today and deal with them constructively, right? And I just want to support 100%, Kelly, what you were saying about this idea that we can talk for hours, days about, was this person good or evil? The answer is yes. Okay, we're done. And so the question then, the fruitful ground is, what did they leave us today? And why are these conversations so uncomfortable, right? And that's where the good stuff happens, to say, we've got a legacy, whether it be John Muir, John A. MacDonald, anybody else. They have left us. They've shaped who we are today, and we carry them inside us for better or for worse. And that's what we need to start talking about. 100%.
Call out a comment that was made quite a while ago in the chat, but that was really, I thought, really powerful. Some of these seeming contradictions are things that many folks have been wrestling with for a long time. Anyone who is a member of a group that has had challenge, that has had to somehow reconcile the promise that this country is supposed to have with their own lived and their familial experiences. I mean, it is possible to hold multiple truths and deal with them, and we need to talk about those. John Muir can have been an incredible visionary for his time with regard to preservation, and also have been a very typical rich white man when it came to racist issues. And it's possible to hold those two truths at the same time. To some degree, I think a lot of people prefer a very simplistic perspective, but let's face it, the world is not simple. It is complex and it is nuanced. And to be honest, we do our audiences a disservice if we assume that they can't handle that. And too often, that's what they crave. They want to talk about the nuances. They want to discuss them. They want help wrestling with them themselves. And I think that when we embrace that, then it doesn't mean that it is easy to talk about these challenging topics, but it does mean that we need to be all in on doing so, and that we can do so without alienating wide swaths of our audiences. We can be on that journey with them in terms of how to talk about these issues and wrestle with these multiple truths.
So the halos can perhaps be large enough to accommodate a more broad kind of story.